He's contributed as a designer and researcher throughout the emergence and growth of the CHI community. Years ago, he was involved in the design of some of the first laptop computers, and for many more years, he has pioneered and advocated the ideas and concepts of interaction design. He was co-founder of IDEO, which is a firm well known for its work to help companies innovate through the design of products, services, environments, and digital experiences. IDEO now has offices all over the world. Bill's also been involved in design education during his career. For example, as a visiting professor of interaction design at the Royal College of Art in London, and associate professor in the design program at Stanford University. In fact, he has a recent book, Designing Interactions, which some of you may know about, and if you don't know about, it will be available at the conference. In fact, MIT, which is the publisher of that book, will have it available for you at the reception tonight. So feel free to visit the exhibit and take a look at Bill's book. And in the meantime, join me in welcoming Bill.
Thank you. Well, what a thrill to be here. So I've called my talk Reaching for the Intuitive. I suppose after 25 years, we all should be feeling very kind of satisfied and pleased and ready to congratulate ourselves for the progress that's been made. After all, the human-computer interaction techniques and processes have become really highly developed and very rigorous, and are implemented on all scales. And the computer science behind them is much more sophisticated than it has been, and continues to grow in sophistication. So I wonder, so what should we reach for that's a little different? And I'm thinking that perhaps it's time, after the first 25 years, to embrace some of the more subjective, qualitative, intuitive aspects of design, to expand beyond just the rigor, beyond just the sophistication of the science, and try and think of ways in which we can harness the subconscious, the more subtle, subjective attributes of design. And that's really what I'd like to talk to you about this morning. First, to answer the question, why is that useful now? And second, to talk a little bit about how it could be achieved. So I think there are two reasons that it is important and useful to bring in intuition. The first is this question of complexity. That, you know, these problems get so difficult that it hurts your head. And the sort of rigorous thinking that you use with your conscious mind, it doesn't have the compassing, the right sort of scope and scale to deal with some of the complexities of today's design problems. And perhaps, like in many of the arts, if we rely more on our intuition, we may reach into subtler and broader places. And then the other thing is that technology is so much more often in our everyday lives today. It's more often been in our work in the past, but it's spreading into every part of our lives. So let me start about thinking about an example of the complexity. I think a phone service is actually a really good example of that, because if you take one of these traditional phones, it was a very simple product, and it perhaps lived on the wall in the hall of your house. And then you went up to it and you grabbed that thing, you stuck it by your ear, and then you wound the handle on the side. And when you spoke into it, although there had to be an infrastructure that connected the wires from your house to the exchange, you were then speaking to another human being. So instead of being a design problem, it was really, from the point of view of the operator, more of a training problem. You had to help the operator understand how to make a connection and also interpret your request and deal with you if you're rude or be sociable or professional. But it was a human-to-human issue based on an infrastructure with a very simple product. Compare that to today. You know, if you want to get in touch with Mrs. Smith in Shady Glen nowadays, first you have to connect through this very complicated set of menus using your thumb, and then you have to go through your address book, And the connection that you have is you to the machine, and then the machine to your friend in Shady Glen. So that there isn't any longer just a training problem. Now it's a design problem. We have to design that interactivity. And think of how difficult a problem designing just that product is. I mean, it's very intimate. You have to put it up to your face and hold it against your face. It's like the intimacy of a wine glass in terms of its subjective and qualitative values. But inside it also has this complicated user interface with a screen and input devices, but a paucity of them when compared to what you're used to with your PC. Tiny screen, only a few buttons, very little when compared to a mouse and a keyboard. So you're trying to do these complicated things, but with this small object. And of course, there's a tremendous engineering challenge in terms of getting all that stuff into this small portable device and having it connect to the infrastructure. Add to that the design of the service beyond the connectivity person to person. Now we can get to the internet with these devices. So you have all these providers of services through the internet who are used to designing for big screens and mice and keyboards, trying to provide services that come in through your telephone. So another layer of complexity which makes the design challenge horribly difficult. I thought it would be interesting to try and discover a little bit more how the success stories in that area have worked. And the iMode service was probably the first and most dramatic success story in the world for the internet-based telephone service. It was started in Japan in the late 80s and went in the first 3 years to 33 million subscribers. That's in a country of only 165 million, a pretty amazing achievement. And it was done by NTT Docomo, by a small team like a Skunkworks or a Spinout. Inoki-san there, you can see on the right, was the leader from inside Docomo. Mari Matsunaga, who wrote that nice book, The iMode, Birth of the iMode, was brought in from Recruit, which is a magazine publisher. She was very good with small messages that you get onto that little screen. And Natsuno-san was the developer of the business strategy. So I went to Tokyo. This is Shibuya, by the way, where you can go for your evening's enjoyable meal or your karaoke. And I met with Takeshi Natsuno. He was the one who was best at English. And he explained the approach that they'd used to designing this new iMode service. This is a summary of what he said.
I joined NTT Docomo 5 years ago to launch this service. Now I have more than 32 million subscribers, and I also have more than 12 million Java phone users. The toughest thing I had to overcome was how to migrate internet way of thinking with this legacy telecom way of thinking. Handset can represent your taste. That's why we are always making a really heavy effort for the tiny details. And also the shape, how round it should be. It's very important. To keep antenna, sometimes very important because in the lifestyle, some people using like this. We have to coordinate all the value chain from the handset to the content, because to have this kind of software here means you have to have a content provider for this, you have to have a network service to support this, and finally to have great design phone is very important. User interface of the phones should be easy enough for everybody. We requested our handset vendors to have an iMode button to launch iMode service, and also 4 direction keys like this. We developed more than 180 icons. Each icon shows some messages like heart mark always shows you some kind of love messages. When I first introduced iMode phones, the capability was just to browse the web and to send and get receiving emails. With the second generation, you started to download color graphics, you started to download ringtones from the network to the phone. And with third generation iMode phone, thanks to Java capability, you can customize the function of the phone. So some people customize their phone as a karaoke machine. So to see the script here and to sing a song, practice.
So I think Takeshi is very good at being explicit about that hierarchy of complexity, the ladder he talked about of complexity in terms of the design problem. To be successful there, he really did have to have not just a team of people, which indeed he did have with the New Start kind of structure and the people like Mari Matsunaga that they brought in, but also an approach which would encompass this intuitive way of thinking, where they could make decisions quickly without having to justify them before they move forward, using experiment to design. By the way, this young lady who was so thrilled about her ringing tones, you notice that in the left-hand photograph there, she has this cute little bear that's hanging from a chain. And I'd seen that a lot in Japanese women, and I therefore asked her what it was for, expecting her to say, well, it's cute. But she said, well, in Japan, we wear a lot of makeup. And the result of that is that when you put the phone to your cheek, you smear the screen. So we use our little toys to wipe off the screen. Very practical. Now, I think the problem of complexity that I'm talking about is best illustrated by failure as well as success. And Natsuno-san was very sort of up about his incredible successes. He did claim that you could use the phone service to practice your karaoke. Well, I don't really believe that, do you? He also said that you could use it to buy a soft drink from a machine. And it just happened that a human factors person and our admin person in the Tokyo office had done an observation of this process a few months before and taken a video of what it was like to actually try and purchase this soft drink. This is what happened on a cold November morning.
えっちゃんもいいよ、入っても。いや、画面のリスト。あ、大丈夫です。変える？どうですか？来てますか？やったー。なんか音が。恐ろしいですね。マジで。おめでとうございます。感動。結局100円入れてるし。お疲れ様でした。ありがとうございます。超ね。
So I don't think that the designers of that website working at Coca-Cola did much in the way of user testing, do you? I don't think they did much in the way of prototyping either, let alone using intuitive design processes. Really, they hadn't started. It was interesting also that AT&T decided to import the iMode service to America and do an American version. And they asked us at IDEO to help them with the design of the interactions. They called it M-Mode. Of course, the first thing that we found out with a little study of people was that the way phones are used in the two countries and two cultures are almost diametrically opposite. You know, in Japan, most people have a long train commute, maybe an hour and a half on a train. And there it's actually rude to talk on the phone. It's impolite, so people don't actually receive phone calls at all. They put their phones on mute. But they have tons of time to work on button stuff. So they're very patient about learning how to use internet access things with multiple keystrokes, lots of thumbing, a quite complicated user interface. Whereas us in America, we drive to work in our cars. We can't button a thing, but we can shout to our heart's content. So the way we use it is almost diametrically opposite. So the second question about why intuitive design is, I think, because technology is moving more into our lives as consumers. Rather than just being in our work lives, it's becoming much more part of everybody's daily life. And so all of those qualitative, subjective questions about designing something that's aesthetically satisfying, enjoyable, beautiful, all those things become much more important as we move forward into this consumer world. I talked to David Liddell about this, and he was very articulate about this change. David Liddell, of course, was the project manager of the STAR user interface when he was at PARC, went on to found Metaphor Computer, which was successful, and then was the leader at Interval, and he's now a venture capitalist here in Silicon Valley. But here he is talking about this change.
The adoption of a fresh technology ordinarily passes through three stages. First, to enthusiast users who actually love and appreciate a technology in an aesthetic way, who enjoy exploiting it. And the fact that it may be a bit difficult to use actually adds to the fun. The 35mm cameras used by the astronauts in the 50s nearly required a PhD in optics to operate them. Now, once enough enthusiasts have their hands on a product technology, sooner or later, one of them will say, I can use this in my work. And they get a clever idea about how they're going to do something highly practical with it. In the case of the 35mm camera, when it went from very expensive Exotica to being used by professional photographers and serious photographers, but broadly used, suddenly it stabilized. The viewfinder was in one place. You exposed by pushing with your right index finger. You wound the film with a lever with your left hand. You focused in a particular way. So there was a stabilization of the controls, even though they were all highly manual. After a product has built up big enough volumes through this business phase, that's when suddenly one begins to reach a price point where it's practical for consumers to buy it. And so in that stage, the priorities for the product have dramatically changed. And one thing that we always see is that most of the important controls become automatic. So now, to follow our camera analogy, today you buy a 35mm camera, it has, if it even has film in it, it will read the film speed automatically and set the exposure automatically and set the flash automatically, and everything is done. And actually a chimpanzee can take a pretty good photograph with today's 35mm highly automatic camera. The enthusiast wants that product to say, exploit me, look at my capabilities. The business user wants the product to say, look at the productivity I can give you. Here's how I'll change your activities. The consumer wants the product to say, look at how I fit in with your style. Here's who you are if you use me and enjoy my capabilities.
So my idea there is that the intuitive design processes will help us navigate this confusion and also help us to create the sorts of designs that people can fall in love with and enjoy. Just to step aside for a moment, those two interviews that I showed you on the video come from the DVD at the back of my book. This is the book, and I interviewed 40 different people in the field. The great thing about interaction design is that everybody's still around, you know. I was able to go back and talk to Doug Engelbart and people who invented things first time. So some of the stuff is about that early process of invention. Some of it's more about particular subject areas, and some of it's more conjectural in the future. And I'm interested in multiple media, so I did the videos for the recording the interviews and edited them down, put them in a DVD that's in the back of the book, and also put up a website so that people could browse the content and also get hold of it without having to pay for anything if they wish and they're patient enough. We have a chapter of the week which includes a PDF of the chapter plus the quick times of the videos that can be downloaded on a weekly basis. So if you wait your 12 weeks, you can go all the way through and have all of the material in soft form. And then you go to the interview page, you can click on any of those interviews, and it gives you a little postage stamp version of the video online. And you can go to the chapter page and get a summary of the chapter. So for example, on the Adopting Technology chapter, which is where David Liddell's piece comes from, there's a little summary there. And, oh, by the way, that's somebody being kind to a visitor, you know, realizing that it would be impossible to use the remotes in the home for anybody who's not familiar with it, wrapped in paper, hiding all of the buttons that are not relevant, and clearly labeled in English for the purposes that they're actually used. So now let me move more from the why to the how. How can we harness intuition? And I think that there's sort of questions about understanding design and design thinking, how that works, and also developing design skills. Understanding what design is and how to define it's always a very tricky subject because most designers are very inarticulate about that, and if they give you any definition at all, it's usually a rather bad joke. But Charles Eames, I think, was very explicit in terms of telling a story there, and he has this wonderful interview with Madame Amique in Paris at an exhibition where he goes with a Q&A through a very carefully rehearsed and concise a description of what design is and how it works. And I think the plan for arranging elements to accomplish a particular purpose is a very nice, succinct summary there. But the art thing is interesting as well, in that, you know, what he's saying is that art is only part of design if it's already achieved its expression of purpose. In other words, it has to work first, and then if it's good enough, you might recognize that it has a value that's higher, artistic value. And then my idea of your head hurting, you know, the sort of idea of trying to harness tacit knowledge rather than just explicit knowledge. I have the analogy of the iceberg, you know, that if you think of the way the mind is, our conscious mind is like the little bit that sticks above the water. And we have this huge amount of subconscious capacity in our brains, which we use all the time. Everybody uses it, of course, but they don't really know how to explain it very well. They can act on it, though, and we can go forward in a process. We can do things using our intuition, but we find them very difficult to justify or to explain. So the idea is to really harness that, everything that's underneath the water there. So I think, you know, one has to ask, well, what are the skills one needs to acquire to operate successfully as a designer? Everybody is a designer, of course, to some extent. I mean, we all make design decisions about our lives and things we do. But to be a skilled designer who's really able to do it well, what are the skills? And I think that list is something that sums it up rather nicely. Chris Connolly teaches at the IIT Institute of Design in Chicago, and he's in charge of developing a curriculum. And these quotes were taken from an informal conversation with him a few years ago. But it seemed to me a rather nice 5 attributes to sum up design skills. I'd like to take you through each of those and give you an example that comes from the book. So the first is the framing or reframing of the problem or the objective, trying to figure out what the brief is, really. Jeff Hawkins does this rather nicely when he's talking about the development of the Palm and the Palm OS when he started with that endeavor. Here he is.
So when I was at Grid, we did the laptops, we did the Grid Pad. These are all sort of larger devices. But when we were selling the Grid Pad, what struck me is I had a lot of people love the product. I had numerous people came up to me who were using it for some vertical application. They said, you know, if you could only make this thing smaller, and I could sort of put my personal data on it, it would be really, really clever. I'd really like this. And it struck me that in the future, that everyone would be carrying something in their pocket. I decided to leave Grid because I felt that would be the best way of getting a sure footing starting a consumer electronics company to focus on portable devices. And that was the beginning of Palm Computing. So one day I was sitting with one of our board members. He says, well, do you know what product you should be building? And I kind of lied. I said, yeah. But I hadn't really sat down and thought exactly what would I do if I started from scratch. But I said, yeah, I know it. And he says, well, why don't you go figure what that is? And I said, well, that means we have to do the whole thing. We have to do the hardware, the software, the operating system, everything. I'm going to do it from scratch. He said, well, what else are you going to do? I said, all right, great. So literally in a day and a half, almost one evening, I basically laid out the premises of what became the Palm Pilot. We had a whole bunch of accumulated knowledge by now, having worked on the Zoomer and the Newton and General Magic products, but no one had ever said, how would you put it all together? And so I came up with the 4 premises. I said, well, it had to be a certain size, and I made a model that very evening out of wood. And then I wrapped it in paper, and so it was a pocket-sized device, and I just sort of figured out what would be practical and what we could do. Then, that was one attribute. I picked a price point of $299, which was very low at the time. Another goal was it would have synchronization with the desktop built in. Up to that time, everyone thought synchronization was this add-on. And I realized that was the application. And the last thing we picked was that it had to be fast. And the metric we used, it had to compete with paper. We realized that our competition was paper. The software guys came back and they said, well, we can't do all the stuff you want to do in software with that slow a processor. And I said, sure you can, because when we were at Grid, we had a more sophisticated operating system which ran on a slower processor, and it was fast. So if we could do it back then, I don't want to hear about it. We can do it now. And sure enough, we were able to do it. We made a product that was really very fast. So those 4 things, the price, the size, the synchronization, and that sort of user expectation model were the 4 design criteria for the Palm Pilot. One of my design goals for it was that there would be no weight cursors. We don't want those. That's a crutch for bad design. Another one, I said, we're not going to have any error dialogues, and especially ones where you ask the question of the user and the user doesn't know how to answer it. So we came up with a bunch of design criteria like that, where I used it as a way of sort of like solving a lot of the problems I saw with PCs. I said, well, these are stupid. Let's not do that. This is stupid. Let's not do that. And so it was a good formula. In the end, it worked.
So Jeff talks about doing that framing of the problem in 3 days. Of course, he did use his intuition to consolidate those 4 attributes that would form the basis of the Palm. But I think it would be a mistake to think that that was a 3-day project. In fact, it was based on all those years of developing products that he'd gone through, the cycle of development and the tremendous experience. So if you can bring that intuition to bear after a lot of rigorous work, then the productivity can be very high, I think. By the way, Jeff is also a little schizophrenic in that he's always been interested in neuroscience as well as being a computer entrepreneur. And he's now started a company called Numenta, which is doing a new computer architecture based more on the structure of the human brain. Keep an eye on that, could be interesting. So then number 2, to create and envision alternatives, another design skill. Can I go back really far for this one? This is Tim Mott. Tim was at PARC for a while and was one of the people, at least, who came up with the idea of a desktop metaphor for the PC. He went on to form Macromind. Well, he first joined Electronic Arts as one of the founders, and then went on to form Macromind and built those tools that we use in interaction design. But here he's telling the story of his early work on those computers.
I was hired by a publishing company that Xerox owned at the time to manage a project they were doing with PARC to learn the system that was being built there, take it back to the publishing company, and have people at the publishing company use it. I wrote a letter of resignation and said, you know, this is not a project that you should be doing, period. That letter found its way to Bob Taylor, who was running the computer science lab at the time. I sat down and spent some time with Bob, and he basically said, well, why don't you figure out what it is we should be doing? That was when I started working with Larry Tesler. The way we went about the design was to actually work with the editors at GIN. I went back, I spent several weeks with them and put them in front of an imaginary display with a real keyboard and a real mouse, and asked them if they could sort of walk me through imagining using that hardware to edit. I think once Larry and I hit on this idea of having people talk about how they would want to do the work they did today, but with a new set of tools, the design itself became pretty simple as well, because there was a methodology that came out of it. Somewhere in one of my notebooks in Xerox, there is a bar napkin with one of the first desktop metaphors. We had this very intuitive text editor, and we were working on what we thought was going to be a very intuitive page layout system, but we were still stumbling, all the users were still stumbling around things like filing and printing and deleting. As I was thinking about this, it just occurred to me that there was no reason why we couldn't use the same approach and build an environment that allowed people to move documents around in the same way that we were allowing them to move text around inside a document. And we didn't call it the desktop, we called it the Office. We actually called it the Office Schematic, was the first name that it had. But it was very similar to the desktop metaphor that we see today.
I should say that drawing on the napkin had to be a reconstruction. I went to Stu Card at PARC, and he looked through the notebooks that he could find, but couldn't find the actual diagram. So we had Tim re-sketch what he could remember of this napkin sketch, and then we did it in front of the camera. Interesting, though, that he was using this idea of participatory design in order to create design alternatives, and that's perhaps one of the early examples of that, where you actually talk with users and go through a process together in a participatory fashion in order to try and discover insights about what they might be able to do if the context of their tools change. So the next skill there is to select from those alternatives when they're generated, however they're generated, knowing intuitively just how to choose quickly the best approach. And that, I think, is a very important design skill. I could continue the story here with Larry Tesler himself, because he worked with Tim, as Tim just mentioned, but he also worked with Bill Atkinson when he moved from PARC to Apple, and came up with Bill with a lot of the important ideas for the interfaces that we see on the Mac.
We got in this pattern, Bill and I, where he worked nights and I worked days. And we overlapped morning and night. Tim Mott and I did the same thing. We worked 14-hour shifts, Tim and I, overlapping by an hour both ends. So we could tell the other guy what we'd done. We shared 1 alto between us. So I'd work for, 12 hours, and he'd show up. I'd tell him what I had done, and then he would just pick up the code I was doing. He could work on the code another 12 hours. Then I'd come in, and he'd show me what he had done, and we'd brainstorm user interface, and then continue. We did that for days on end to get the thing working. With Bill, I would run user tests all day. It was easy to find subjects. Every new Apple employee had never used a computer before. Well, not all day, but I'd run 3 or 4 tests during the day on whatever Bill had given me the night before. Then I'd give him a report at the end of the day and say, here's what I learned today. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? And we would talk about ideas, and then he'd go up and go home and spend the night programming, and come in the morning with a new version for me, and then go home and go to bed. And that's how we developed the first Lisa user interface specification. There was a dominance of people from HP working on the Lisa team. They had already gone to putting a row of buttons at the bottom of every window. So it was a big menu tree that you had to sort of keep in your head. And you'd have to walk down and go like edit, insert, you know, that sort of thing, and walk down the hierarchy. Anyway, I thought this was just horrible mode. That was the interface. No, guys. People can't keep all these menu hierarchies in their heads, and everything needs to be apparent. So one day I said to Bill, why don't you try something different? Why don't you try moving it to the top of the screen? So he went home, and he came in the next day, went directly to Steve Jobs' office to show him first, I think, and then came over to us to show us. And in one night, he had developed the entire pull-down menu system. Everything. I mean, he hadn't just moved it to the top of the screen, which was what I'd suggested. He had gotten the idea of, as you scan your mouse across the top, each menu would pop up, you know, without you having to, like, you know, click each one, which is what was in my head. And they would ruffle, you know, as you went back and forth and appear, so you could scan them all. I went, oh, right, this is what we want. We want everything to be apparent. He'd come up with highlighting them as you moved your mouse back down inside them, command shortcuts. He thought up the whole thing in one night. It was, I can't imagine what happened that night.
That was a nice attribution, wasn't it? You know, I think, again, although Bill Atkinson was able to use his intuition to make this incredible stride forward just during that one night, he wouldn't have been able to do it if he hadn't been working continuously on these prototypes, and the prototypes and testing on a daily basis with this 24-hour cycle for weeks before they could get to the point of making those creative decisions. So the intuition is a kind of important moment of crystallization, but based on all the HCI and the computer science that went before. And luckily, Bill actually took Polaroids of all his Mac screens. He's working on these prototypes. And we have a record of these alternatives that he generated before he actually made those crucial decisions about the pull-down menu structure, for example. And there's a whole lot of those that are available on the web to look at. By the way, Bill Atkinson is now writing a little bit of code for Numenta, as well as doing his photography. And Larry Tesler is working at Yahoo. We had a lot about prototyping there, didn't we? I think prototyping is a sort of a central tool that runs all the way through my stories. Visualizing ideas and prototyping them, and doing that quickly in order to see what things work quickly and see if they fail, move on to the next iteration. We've heard that time and time again already. But here's a story from Matt Hunter, who was working with me in San Francisco. He now works in our London office. And this was the story that he tells about helping with digital photography in a project for Kodak.
So in about 1995, Kodak came to IDEO in order to understand the future of digital cameras. And really, there were two main insights. Digital cameras live within a product and service ecology. George Eastman created Kodak by understanding that you've got your box Brownie camera, but you press the button, we do the rest. He's turning the development of film, which was a messy hobby with chemicals, into a mass market consumer thing. But also, secondly, you've got to understand why is it that people take pictures in the first place. You really need to go back to underlying user motivations. Photography is a means of self-expression, it's a means of recording information, but more than anything, photography is a social enterprise. It's about building social capital, it's about sharing ideas. So having got this vision of where digital cameras might be going, you need to actually begin to implement that. And so we decided to tackle what a digital camera might look like. What we understood immediately was that where cameras previously were purely about capturing an image, a digital camera would suffer from the challenge that you were not only capturing images, but you'd have to review images, share them with others, possibly delete images, make a voice annotation, email or even order prints from the camera itself. So we needed to create some sort of information architecture or interaction architecture, some extensible series of rules that would allow not just one camera to be designed, perhaps a whole series. And a second choice was to decide how we would communicate that. Of course, we could have just created a booklet, a report which would give very clear instruction.
but instead we decided that we wanted to make something more experiential, a user experience prototype, we called it. It was a big box with a security camera jammed on the front, a very fat umbilical cord going to a Macintosh Tower computer, and it was all running Macromedia Director. And here, in a matter of a few weeks, we crafted a user interface on the camera, allowed you to take a picture and delete it and send it across the room to a TV. And what was interesting was that it really expressed not only what was going on, what were the features and functions, but how it felt. Kodak took this prototype and only about 8 months later turned it into the DC-210, which was one of the best-selling cameras of the time. So it was a remarkable way, I think, to influence a camera that was already in development and begin this first step towards this future of new digital cameras.
So the experience prototype, the point being that people can try it out themselves and experience what it's like and get a sense of the possibilities that the design allow. And then, of course, user testing becomes a very obvious thing, a very obvious possibility. But I think the idea of trying to get the full experience in the prototyping process is an important design attribute. And this last one is really perhaps the sort of overall, I mean, the synthesis concept runs all the way through design skills, I think. I mean, if you think about what happened with Bill Atkinson that night, he was clearly synthesizing those ideas for the pull-down menus intuitively, and he was doing it in a way that involved synthesizing from all those constraints that he understood from previous work and experience. But it's important to realize that that's a skill that we can develop and teach and learn, as well as having as an innate talent. And I thought it'd be interesting to look at a more systemic example to try and illustrate this. And I chose the iPod story. Paul Mercer was working on the Newton when he was at Apple, and he left and formed his own company called Pixo, doing chipsets. And he was in charge of the chipsets for the iPod. But he tells the story of the success of the iPod in a very simple and clear way.
If you look at the culture of Apple, it is a company that's had 25 years of building personal products, and you know, in the last few years, they've had a very, very astute individual at the top that can really dictate in many ways or arbitrate what's good and not good. That culture, that management capability that's at Apple makes it unique in this industry. You know, I think to answer the question of why the iPod is so great compared to the competition, if you break it down, they started very slowly and they built it up over the years. They started by acquiring the technology. They acquired a company called SoundJam to build iTunes, and this was back in, I think, 99, 2000 or so. And they turned that into the iTunes franchise, starting first on the Macintosh. The ability to generate the music, to let the user rip that music. How do you get that content at the beginning? That's the root of the problem. You've got to have it. So Apple invested in iTunes and built that up and improved it over the years. In 2001, Apple shipped the first device that synchronized with iTunes. The two were deeply integrated together. Now keep in mind, the iPod is very simple-minded in terms of at least what the device does. It's very smooth in what it does, but the screen is very low resolution. It really doesn't do much other than let you navigate your music. The simplification that went into the design of it was very well thought through, and the capability to build it, is not commoditized. It's very curious, right? Because the iPod's been out there. It's been essentially unchanged in terms of its core software design and user interface design has remained unchanged for about 3 years now. And then in 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store, and this again was something that did not exist at a level that was mass marketable. Apple was the first to make it mass market capable. They applied that Apple magic to make that possible. They took their time in doing that. And it was, remember as well, it took Apple a couple of extra years before iTunes for Windows was actually developed and shipped. And so again, they're practically moving in slow motion, really, if you look at it in hindsight. But the industry has not been able to match it. And so now today, Apple's moving into color displays, and eventually they'll move into video as Moore's law continues. giving us its bounty.
So the success comes from synthesizing all those different attributes in the entire system, not just the object. I think a lot of people think of iPods as successful because they're beautiful product designs, and indeed they are. And the interaction design is also great, I think. But without the synthesis of the tools on the computer, the iMusic store, etc., it would have been impossible to have that level of success. So the synthesis of all those aspects is a part of the design process. So you will see in the book, if you have a look at that in chapter 10 is more of a how-to chapter that goes through these ideas of people and prototypes and techniques within those in a more detailed way than I've had time for this morning. But I thought that I just wanted to try and explain some of those attributes of design skills as I see them. But I see my time's run out, so I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bill, for a very interesting talk, and it was great to see some of those interviews and go back into our design history. Now we've got some questions for you that have been sent up by our student volunteers. So here's one. Has to do with intuition. You probably thought you'd get asked about that. The problem, of course, with intuition is that it's often wrong. Do you believe this, or do you believe that intuition is usually correct? Since so much of design is a social process, how do you convince another person in your team that your intuition is better than hers?
Well, I think it's definitely difficult, isn't it? It's like with most things in life. You can do it badly and you can do it well. And it's often a question of having the judgment which helps you decide that something is good. If you think of a scientist coming up with a new concept for something scientific, they're still going to use an intuitive process, but they'll have that knowledge and understanding, if they're a really great scientist, to know that it's a breakthrough. I think the same thing happens with design, that if we think of using intuition as a tool, as part of our vocabulary, and then we also get good at deciding which alternative is best, then we can move forward very quickly and effectively.
Cool. So, who can design intuitively? In other words, how do you educate a good intuitive designer?
Well, of course, a lot of the problem for designers and about designers is that a lot of their education is learning by doing. It's a question of trying things. And the sort of talent that brings you that ability, that allows you to be a good designer, is something where you do just trust your doing of it. And when you go to a design school, you do project and project and project. You're doing things all the time. And there's very little time spent analyzing and trying to understand how that happens. It might be worth drawing a parallel to some other arts. For example, if you take poetry, which is an art which has been with us for such a lot longer than the design skills, and you think of people who study poetry at a university, the people who are PhDs in poetry, for example, those are the ones who start to understand how poetry works and what its background is like, what its history is like, but they're probably not the best poets. The best poets are the ones who really do operate intuitively. And I think design has now reached the stage where perhaps we should try and get some PhDs who understand a little bit more about how it works, because so far we've just had the people who are good designers around.
Good point. Okay, a lot of your examples were of devices and innovative interfaces and so on. What thoughts do you have about designing social systems? What aspects of designing artifacts are applicable? Which ones are not? Is it a whole different ballgame?
Well, it amazes me, actually, because when I went to design school in the 60s, I was expecting to graduate from industrial design program and make designs for objects that were mass-produced in metals and plastics for the whole of the rest of my life. And now I find that I'm working in a company at IDEO where we're designing almost everything, including social systems. I think services actually are a very interesting example of that. If you think about the difference between designing an interface or an object and a service, the service immediately adds a social system element to it. And then, of course, you connect everything together and you have this, the internet possibility, and it becomes more of a global social system. perhaps even connected to anthropology or sustainability.
Interesting. Okay, so you've provided many engaging examples of design successes. Yet there are many other fairly simple products, VCRs, washing machines, for example, that are still notoriously difficult to use. Why haven't the design skills you've outlined had an impact on such products?
It's puzzling, isn't it? I mean, why do you have to wrap your remote controllers in pieces of paper so your friends can use them? I think we have failed. Industry has failed. Designers have failed. Engineers have failed in dramatic ways to make these things as simple as they can be and they should be. When you look at something like the iPod, actually, it's a wonderfully simple little interface. And do you remember that time about 10 years ago when there was this great idea about appliances, that everything was going to be single purpose rather than multi-purpose in the way that computers had been in the past? And there was a surge of interest in that idea. It didn't quite get over the sort of difficulty of achieving a whole range of things, but perhaps that will happen in the future, that we'll go to our garage and we'll pick out our tool, a hammer or a chisel or something. We don't expect to have a universal tool. And perhaps we're going to see more individual application devices, which then can be made much simpler. And the enemy of simplicity really is the general purpose device.
Okay. Okay, here's a puzzler. What's the difference between an intuition and a preconception? Is one good, the other bad?
Well, I think, there's a lot of difference there, but depending on the context of your design. If you're actually working on the next iteration of an existing product or system or design, then to have a preconception is probably an essential part of the process. You need to understand the state of the art, to know what the previous design was like, in order to be able to move forward iteratively from it. However, if you're going to start and try and do something that's completely precedent-setting and new and innovative, then of course there is no preconception that's valid. And you have to really start by using techniques like which include intuition.
Okay, good. Okay, this is the last question. We're running out of time. If design thinking is so valuable, how is it possible that business school thinking is better paid, better appreciated than design thinking? That's a tough one.
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic about that. Of course, if you want to make money, you go into the money business, don't you? I mean, you wouldn't go into the design business. It's not surprising that they're better paid. On the other hand, I do think there's a huge sea change in terms of the attitude that business has to design. Only a few years ago, no business schools had anything to do with design. And now you find every respectable business school has a design program of sorts in it. And you find a lot more interdisciplinary efforts, like the ones at Stanford with the D School, where they're joining business school folks to design people, to social scientists, and so on. So I think we can see design is spreading its influence and becoming recognized as a tool for business as well as for research and development.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to have to call it quits now, but Bill will be around so you can ask him questions in person. You don't have to hand him an index card. So thank you once again.